We're now at the stage where we can enter our data, and through the magic of television, I'm going to cut to the chase here and just paste in some values that I put together earlier. But let me talk a little bit about the data. For one, note that we have 4 students here: Bob, Ted, Carol, and Alice. And note in particular that the homework scores, homeworks 1 through 5, note that the scores vary between 0 and 5. Note that the quizzes 1 through 3, note that they vary between 0 and 10. And note that the midterm and final exam seem to range from 0 to 100, which is standard. So our convention, when we assign homework, homework is typically a formative assessment tool. Students are entitled to make mistakes, and we want to give them a lot of homework so they get a lot of practice, but we don't want it to count against them if they make mistakes. Furthermore, because we have a lot of homework to grade, typically every night in a K-12 situation, you want to make the grading scale as coarse as possible so that you can just look at something and give it a 4 or a 3 or a 5 depending on what the student has done. So it's typical to use a very coarse grading scale when you're doing a formative assessment such as a homework, whereas quizzes are summative for a particular unit, and typically we want a little more granularity, so we'll rate those from 0 to 10 to give us that granularity. And then by the time we get to the midterm and final exam, well, they're fully summative, not formative. So a summative grade indicates what the students accomplished, and we want the most granularity there, a very fine level of detail, and that's why we tend to score high stakes exams on a 100-point scale. So we all know that, of course, if a student gets a 4 out of 5, that's approximately an 80. So the scaling factor to normalize that data or to standardize it at a 100-point scale, we would have to multiply the homeworks by 20 to standardize them on a 100-point scale or translate them to their equivalent in terms of 100 points. Now the quizzes, again, since those are scored from 0 to 10, we would need to scale them by a factor of 10 in order to standardize them on a 100-point scale. The midterm and final, of course, are already standardized on a 100-point scale. So that will come into play when we do our calculations, but just make an observation for now. Homeworks on the left are formative assessments. The midterm and final on the extreme are summative in nature, higher degree of granularity for summative assessments, coarser grain of detail on the formative assessments, and quizzes are somewhere in between. Now, when you type in your data, of course, there are no decimal points in this data, and we'll have a little bit more to say about formatting decimal data. But one thing I will do, and this is my convention, I like to select ranges of cells in a given assignment, and I like to apply some background formatting. So typically, I'll give the homeworks a sort of a chiffony type color, and then quizzes, I tend to color those a shade of green, and then the midterm and final, maybe because I associate them with blue books, I tend to give them a shade of blue as a color. So when I'm looking at my range of data, I can quickly eyeball a range of data and by the color coding I've applied. The other thing I'll mention here also is that certainly you can tighten up your data ranges a little bit. For example, column A, if you wanted to narrow that a little bit, you could. But what we're going to do next is we're going to look at our computed data, the data that goes in the average, weighted average, and grade columns. So once you've set up this data, and you can make reference to the template that I've made available to you in the project area. Again, use your own names, make up your own scores, and another distinction there too. When we talk about numeric data, we use the term scores. When we talk about grades, we talk about letter grades. So good mnemonic is numeric score letter grade. We'll revisit this in the next installment.